Okay, so I'm going to talk about Angular, but the main thing is we use Angular CLI, and this is a tool that makes it way easier to build all of the pieces. You don't have to write the same repetitive code over and over or copy and paste it. I know a lot of people here are familiar with React, and if you've ever used Create React app, this is like that, but like with more stuff. So first thing you do is install Angular CLI globally if you want to use it. It's a super useful tool. And hopefully you can see it already. Here's their homepage. And I already made mine, my code. It's all set up. It's in a GitHub repo if people want it. But if you're creating a new project, you just type ng new and then whatever project name that you want. And then there's other flags that you can set if you want to make a new one that has routing, like most apps need routing. You can set that flag. You can set up all sorts of other things, but this is like the most common one that you're going to need. And it'll run, it'll build an app, and you'll end up with something more like this. This is where I've already built a lot of things because I don't want to have to code in front of everyone, every little piece, because I'll definitely mess up. But you're going to get something that has just this app routing. If you set that routing flag, you're going to get a component CSS. You're going to get an app component HTML, which is going to be what the page looks like. It'll generate this spec file for you. That's for unit testing, and I'm not going to go over that today because it can get pretty involved, so we'll just ignore that one. And you also have an app component.ts. And part of the reason I wanted to start with the code already up is so I could show you one of the cool things about TypeScript. So this .ts means TypeScript instead of JavaScript. And with TypeScript, one of the key features why it's called TypeScript is you can get strong typing. You know, sometimes you're writing JavaScript code and it's like, well, I don't know what this method is asking for, or stuff like that. So this helps make it clearer what the code wants, and it also means that whatever you're using, I'm using Visual Studio Code, it'll tell you the error before you even run anything. Like, hey, you're trying to give a number to a string or whatever that like it's not going to work the way that you think it is. So it gives you that warning ahead of time and makes it way easier to find where you've messed up if you made a mistake. So I've got this interface set up, and this is just a template for what we're going to do a Madlib app. That's what I'm going over today. So I have a Madlib template, and it's going to expect blanks. It's going to expect a value, and this is going to be the story where the blanks get filled into, and then a title. And we can use this interface to say, what I get back from my service, it should look like this. And that's going to be, don't worry about all this stuff. I'm going to show you it step by step how I got all here, but I just want to show the typing. Oh, it's in the service. Okay. So here's where I'm telling it, this is the specific kind of feedback that we want, is this type. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I just wanted to show the typing because that's really cool. It's a really useful feature in TypeScript. And all of these .ts, that's JavaScript, but it's TypeScript. It's more specific JavaScript, kind of. So we start out with an app module. This is the kind of the root of the tree where everything else feeds into for an Angular app. So everything's going to run out of this app module. And I can have more than one app module or more than one differently named module in my application in different subfolders, but they all have to feed in and get imported into this main app module to actually run. And this is where we import all the stuff that the app is going to need when you start out, it's just going to have, if you ran that command to generate a new one, you're going to have like something like that. There's going to be nothing imported. But as you build out your app, you get more and more pieces added in. So that's most important. Make sure everything that you need is imported into here. And then the app component, this is where you're going to have maybe some basic TypeScript for the first like entry point, like that wrapper page where you're going to see stuff. So to show you in my browser here, I closed the example. I will run the example in a moment. You're going to have like maybe a title and maybe a title bar or a nav bar. It's going to be in this app component area, that first part of the application. So you can see my code here. I've got a container that holds a side nav and a toolbar, and then the main content and a toolbar. And I've got everything else commented out so that when I run it, we're not going to see a whole bunch of stuff on the page. We're just going to see a little bit. So I hope you can all see that on the bottom. I'm typing ng serve and then 2 dashes and then open. And this means Angular CLI is going to build my app and then open it in the browser automatically for me. And it will take a moment because my computer is a little bit slow. But while that's working, we can go back over some of this stuff. What you see here are these custom tags. This looks kind of like HTML, but these are not standard HTML tags. These are all coming from Angular material, and they're custom components. If you're familiar with React, it's kind of like how React does with JSX, and you've got your custom components that you've added. You add those the same way here. So let me pull up the browser. Angular material has a really good getting started guide to show you how to install it and get it all set up. So I'm not going to go over like every little piece of getting it set up, but once you have it added, it's very useful. Going back to comparison with React, you want to use all those components for styling instead of using the same class name over and over and rebuilding the same things. This is the same idea. It's components that you can use to style things more easily. And hopefully this is finished building. It's taken a very long time. Okay. So with Angular material, it has this built-in wrapper that you use to make it full screen. And then it's got this built-in component for the side nav, and that's going to be just a little panel that shows up on the side, and now it's opening. So there's our side panel, side nav. Here's our main content area, and then title bars. I colored them differently so you can see that there's actually 2 title bars. And you can style them with a whole bunch of different options. If you go out to their website and see, like, the toolbar has tons of different options. You can do a really basic one. You can do them with multiple rows. You can do them different colors. So here's what I'm using. I'm using this color primary back in the code. So you can see this one is set to color primary. This one is set to color accent. And that's how I'm using those different colors. You can also still add classes to them, just like it was a standard HTML element, even though it isn't. The class will work the same way. So right here, I'm making it sticky top, so it'll stick to the top. And that custom CSS I added over here so that it's all laid out for us already. Okay, but that was just the setup, getting started. Those were all the things that I set up initially in the app. And then I started building it out, added these things. The typical way to add like your links in your side nav would just be to add a material nav list. So all of the tags that are from material start with mat dash and then the name of the actual element. Oops, there we go. So now we're going to see links that don't actually go anywhere, but they're going to say 1, 2, 3, and you can see them on the page once it finishes rebuilding. And while this is running, it's going to automatically rebuild every time we save and show up in the browser for us. We're not going to have to like refresh it or anything like that. So now we have 1, 2, 3 showing up in the sidebar. And then the next thing to do is you're going to want a separate component for each page because Angular does single page applications. So you kind of make a wrapper to hold all of it like a frame, and then you add separate components for each page sort of that you want to add. So in this case, I made a Mad Lib page. And to do that, we're going to use Angular CLI, and the command would be, I'm going to type it over here so I don't mess with that terminal. The command would be like ng, and then you're going to type generate so that it makes, oops, that helps if I type it right. So you're going to do ng generate to make a new whatever you want to make, and then you specify what it is that you want to make. In this case, we want a component. And then you're going to give it a name. This component is, I already have one, madlib page. And then you can add different flags if you want to specify different things. That's all in the docs, so I can't go over every single one, but you can add different flags. Like if I wanted no styling, I could do like, I think it's like style none or something like that. I don't even remember all of them because I don't use them very often. I usually use the standard things. So you would hit enter and it's going to run and it's going to make a new component. I'm not going to run it yet though because we already have one. And then what you get is a folder that it generates. It's going to import it automatically into your app module. So I guess right, there we go. So it imports it automatically. All your components go into the declarations array. All of the modules that you import from other libraries or from elsewhere, if you get a really big application, they're all going to be in your imports. Providers would be for like services that you're importing. We're not doing any of that. And then generally you just leave this alone as Bootstrap app component. It's just going to build from the app component. Okay, so if we go back into this folder that got generated, the madlib page folder, we have the same kind of thing as the basic app. We had that app component CSS, now we have madlib page component CSS. Same with the HTML and same with the TypeScript file. So in here, I'm having such a hard time scrolling right now. Okay, so in here, we've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. Right now, I want this to not actually call that, so we're just going to comment it out. So what I started with to build it, so I'm not hitting somebody's API a million times while I build it, is I'll just go and find a template from the data. And this is the template from Madlib's API, which is what we're going to use here. I just copied this example output so that I could build the app around it. And that's what it looks like here. And we gave it this type, Madlib template. Remember that we set up earlier, so that we know that that's the type that we're expecting. So we know that it needs this blanks array, we know that it needs this value array, and we know that it needs a title. So since we've given it that type, we know we're going to have those things, and that makes it easier when we're setting up our HTML template. Oops, wrong one. There we go. So when we look here at the HTML template, we know that we had this Madlib template. We know it has a property of title, so we can show that at the top of the page. And then we know that we have a whole bunch of other stuff. But first, we know that we're going to need a way to do inputs. So this is a form. And when you do a form in Angular, pretty much every time until you get used to it, you're going to run into an error. And let me see if I can make it do this error without blowing everything else up. There we go. You need to import forms module. If you don't, you're going to get an error. And my computer is fighting with me right now. I'm going to try to make it actually throw that error so we can see it. All right, nothing showed up on the page, super frustrating. And it's gonna throw an error that you have to open the console to see. And it's gonna say, there's no directive with export as set to ng model. And it's annoying and not as helpful as you would like it to be, but that means you didn't import forms module. And I bring that up because it gets people a lot. It gets me a lot. I'll have already imported it somewhere else and then forget that I'm in a new project. Oops. And it's as simple as importing that into your main app module. And now when we run it, it should be perfectly happy. Visual Studio Code will help with like imports, but the CLI usually helps when you're adding modules. So that's really what's going to generate the new component and then automatically put it into the app module where it thinks that you want it. Sometimes you have to reorganize it a little. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Visual Studio Code tries to help a little bit, but it's definitely not as good as like straight up Visual Studio at doing that. Okay, so we can close this console. Yeah. Okay. We're pretty much done with the app module at this point. So what I wanted to show before I get into all this complicated stuff is like very simple single input. So I've got just the title here, and then I've got a simple form, and I've told it ng if, and this means like it's an if statement. And it's only going to show this if we don't already have a story, which is back here in the TypeScript. I've set up this story string, and so it's empty right now. If it's empty, then we show the form. And then I'm using this material component again, mat form field. And I gave it an appearance of legacy so that we're going to give it a placeholder, and that'll turn into an actual label for us. It does a lot of like behind the scenes magic that we don't have to worry about. And then you use like a normal input, but Angular has these things called directives. And so this is gonna do, again, a bunch of magic stuff behind the scenes that we just don't have to worry about. It's gonna make it all connect and look the way that we want. And in this case, this mat input is really just adding some CSS styling behind the scenes. So we don't have to remember a ton of different class names ourselves for every component. It also has a name. In this case, we're naming it title. And this is like kind of a variable that you can use in the HTML. So we have to give it a type as well, and we're giving it a type ng model, and that tells it that it is a model for use in a form. And then we're going to tell it that the ng model that it's using is the Madlib template title, same as this title up here. We also have to give it a unique name, so we're giving it this unique name of story title. And in this case, I want to give it a value to start, so I'm specifying this value, and again, it's the same, it's that title. So some of these things look like normal HTML. You've got like placeholder and type, but it's adding these extra things like these brackets around ng model. These brackets tell it input and output. Oops. So the square brackets are, this is being input into this element or this component, and then the regular parentheses, that's telling it this is output from this component. So Angular does a whole bunch of things for the input for us, and it's gonna interpret all of the user input data and then output it for us into the form so that we can use it. Same over here. This one is not doing any output, it's just taking the input value. Another way that we could write this is with the curly brackets, handlebars, mustache, whatever you like to call it. You can instead do it like normal without those brackets, but then this is going to be interpreted as normal text, and that's not really what we want the value to be. So you could do the brackets around it like that if you want. I think it really depends on what project you're working on. I know some people prefer it this way because if you're doing it in Visual Studio, for example, because Visual Studio does a lot more for you, it will highlight these in like hot pink or something like really noticeable, so you can see the variables a lot more easily. For me, if I'm doing it in Visual Studio Code, I really prefer to do the brackets around it on the outside here, because that, when I don't have the crazy color highlighting, that stands out more to me. But either one works. I know in some cases you'll end up being backed into a corner and have to use one over the other, but that's unusual. So it really depends on the project or your own preference if you're just doing your own project. So we've got this all set up, but right now it's not showing because we haven't imported it anywhere. Again, so we've got all this empty stuff. We set up the page, but it's not there. So I'm going to go back into the app component HTML, and right now we're just going to add this back in. So I've got main and then just app-madlib page. And that can also seem like magic. I know that was really frustrating for me. Where is this name even coming from when I first started learning this? It gets generated for you, and where you can find it, if you aren't sure what it should be called, it's going to be this selector in your component. So back in that madlib page, madlibpage.component.ts, it's got these properties set up for a new component, and the one requirement that they all have is that they have to have a selector, and this is the selector for our madlib page. So I added that directly in here. That's the only page that's ever going to show up because we have it just kind of hard-coded. Oops. Oh, that's not what I wanted. There we go. And once that saves, we can go to the browser and hopefully it reloads and we can see. So now we've got how to cross a piranha-infested river. And we can change this to whatever we want, and it's going to reflect immediately in the browser without us saving it at all, because the ng model, we assigned it to this variable that's already being displayed on the page. So if I change this, we see the change reflected immediately. We can really type whatever we want. It shows up right away, which is not really how you usually want a form to work. But you can do it that way if you want something to have immediate feedback or whatever. It's something you can do. But usually you're going to have a separate variable for holding the actual value. Okay. So back here, we don't actually care about changing the page title. We want to keep the same story title because that's what the story is actually called. But we do want to be able to change all of the blanks. So I'm going to get rid of, if my mouse will cooperate, I'm going to get rid of this. And then we're going to use a more complicated form. So this one is actually a loop. So I'm going to add a little spacing here just so we can see a little easier what's going on. So again, that same mat form field, I gave it a class just to change the spacing of it a little bit, change the width. The same appearance legacy that we saw already here, where that was like a placeholder and then it became a label. So every input is going to do that same thing. And then here's the part where it's like Angular is helping us out. We do the star ng4, and that's going to make a for each loop. So we set up a variable saying let word type, and then of the collection that we want to go over. And then I've got this semicolon here, and I can also specify the index. So index is the name that Angular is going to recognize, and then I have to say as whatever I really want to call that index. So inside of this, is this stuff that's going to happen over and over again. And actually, even the element that the ng4 is on, that one is going to get stamped down the page. So we've got this input, and it's the same thing, type text. We're going to assign it this variable and this type. And the cool thing about this is we don't have to have a unique name for this because it is in this for loop, and Angular is going to scope it and treat this as its own thing and know that this word in this loop is this particular input. And we don't have to worry about that colliding with others because Angular will just take care of it for us. I'm also giving it a placeholder just like we saw before. In this case, I've got these curly brackets here, and I'm saying word type, which is the variable that we set, because that's going to be like nouns and adverbs and whatever else that we're going to input. And then I got this vertical line. They do these pipes, is what they call them. In this case, it's a built-in Angular pipe for title case. And that's going to take the value that I put at the beginning and filter it through its own little function to make it title case. It just goes based on like the first word, I'm going to uppercase the first letter, there's a space, I'm going to uppercase the next one. It doesn't worry about like perfect title casing. But it's pretty quick and easy, so we don't have to worry about doing that manually ourselves. The next thing I've got is required. We want every word to be entered, so we're going to tag it with required. And then, again, with the ng model, this means we're inputting and outputting from ng model. And now I've set up, back in the TypeScript, an array of words, and we're using word index, which is why we added that up here, to indicate the index in that array where we want to save this particular word. And back here you can see that. It's just an empty array right now, and we know that it wants to be of type string array, but right now it's just an empty array. And the same with the name. In this case, the name isn't scoped, and we want that to be truly unique. So I'm adding the index. And this is where Kim brought up earlier, the curly braces versus the brackets. You end up using the curly braces more for this kind of thing, where I want word to just be exactly that, exactly what I typed. But I want to add on to it in the curly braces this variable. Oh my goodness. My keyboard and my mouse are so messed up right now. Sorry about this, guys. Okay. So there's that part of it. And then I'm going to skip this mat error. We're going to come back to that. I just want to show what we see on the screen just from that input part. once it refreshes. And now we see it pulled from the template. We need a foreign country, we need an adverb, we need an adjective, we need all of these things, and it stamps them all down the page for us. So we didn't have to type this 15 different times, it just ran through it. And it also recognized that we told it that these were all required inputs. So, you know, you're on most websites, you recognize this star usually means this is required. So it's following that kind of standard and automatically putting in that little star for us so that users more easily recognize this as a required input. So we don't have to worry about it. The next part that I have here is this error tag. And it's formatted all weird right now, so move it over. So this mat error is going to show us a little error message if somebody types something wrong, if they leave it blank in this case, because we don't care what the answer actually is, we just care that they wrote something. And this is only going to show with this ngIf in the case that the word, up here, word, is invalid, but not just if it's invalid, because as soon as it loads, it's invalid, we don't have a value. We also want to say, and the word input is dirty or touched, and that means somebody's typed something or they've, they've highlighted it and then moved on without actually entering a value. So what that looks like is, if I tab away from it, now we see it's red, and it's got this, that input is required. This input is required. And we get to use these curly braces again so that we, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry guys. Here we go. All right, we're using these curly braces again, same as up there. We're giving it the word type, which is, again, like foreign country, adverb, adjective. And then we're putting it in title case. And then we're just giving it literally this string is required. And that works pretty easy too. So as soon as you highlight it, you type something and go away, it's happy. But if I then remove it, now it's angry because it needs a value. And then we can go through all of those and type them in. And, you know, maybe I start typing it and I'm not happy with the answers that I gave. And I decide that I want to start over. Well, I don't have to go back and hit backspace on all of those. We can have a reset button, and Angular makes that pretty easy too. So we can reset all the fields to their original values. And so that's what this button is here. You use a normal button element, like in HTML, but you add this directive so that it styles it for us. We don't have to have a bunch of CSS classes to worry about. We just say it's a raised button, and so then we get our raised button down here. We can say that its type is reset, and that's going to be useful for like the browser and screen readers and stuff. And then this is going to say that this is an output. So normally you would say something like on click and then have like a JavaScript thing that, you know, there's a function for that. In this case, Angular wants us to do as an output of this element, there's a click output, that's the event. And then we can still give it some kind of function. In this case, we've got madlib form, which is the name of this form, and that's of type ng form. And most of these are going to be ng something. That stands for Angular, whatever, you know, whatever the item is. And then we say dot form so that we can access the actual form structure. And then we can access this function on the form called reset. So we don't have to write any of this ourselves. We just tell it to reset with all those built-in functions, which is pretty convenient. But in the case of submit, we're just telling it that this is a submit button, and that's all we've done. because up on the opening form, the form has this output event when the form is submitted. So on ng submit, it outputs this event. It's going to use this function, and that's something that we do have to define. So this function takes the Madlib form, that's what we named over here. We're putting it into this function as input, and we're calling the onSubmit function. And that's going to be something that we define in here. And this is like just a real quick brute force way. OnSubmit, I take this form, and then I can call this .madlib template. Remember, that's where we had all of our story pieces, all of our blank info, and the title. And I can get the value, which is, if you remember up here, value stands for this array of the story fragment pieces, where the blanks go in between. And then I'm just going for each over all of that. I'm getting the fragment and the index and kind of merging them in. I'm not going to go over this like a ton more because that's not really the point of today. But the code is out there if you want to play with it, and you can come up with a way better way of doing this. But this is the quick, easy way. So I've got that on submit, and this is all going to happen when we click submit on the form. So if I save it, and then it refreshes, we can enter a whole bunch of stuff. Let's say China and quickly and red and I don't know, cow. Sorry, there's so many of these blanks, but we got to do all of them. Running, jump. Oh, what's a place, guys? Star space. Soup. I don't know. So then we're going to click submit, and it's going to do all of that function that we had for onSubmit. And when it does that, it assigns all those values to story, which is that string that we had up here that was empty to begin with. And if you look here, I pointed out at the beginning we had that ngIf. We can say if we don't have a story, show the form, which is what we've got set up here. But then when we do have a story that's filled in, then we want to show the story and hide the form. So this kind of just did that really fast for us. So now we can see the story, how to cross a piranha-infested river, and we see all of our little blanks. We had China and quickly and all the things that we filled in. We got star space down here. So it's pretty quick and easy, really, once you get going with it. But the thing is, it does feel like a lot of magic. And there's not really any way around that. It's always doing things in the background for you, so it's always going to feel a little bit like magic. It's not. It's all code, but it's code that you don't have to worry about. So another thing I want to show you here is that we can add a button for new if we want to get a new one, and if we want to use not just this same template, because who wants to only do this story all the time over and over again? That would be boring. Piranha infested river over and over and over. So we want to get a new one, and to do that we have to set up a service and set that up to call an API. So I'm going to pull this up again here. To do a service, you're going to use Angular CLI again, and it's going to set everything up for you in a nice little folder and do all the imports. So you would say ng, you can type out generate, or you can just say G, and that stands for generate. And then you can type out the thing you want to make, so service, or if you want to shorten it, you can just type S. And then the name of the service. In this case, I did madlibs. And that's going to say madlibs.service.ts when it generates. And that's what we've got here, already generated. So we've got this folder for services, and we've got madlibs.service.ts generated. And then here's the code that I've put into it. So I had to import a whole bunch of things. So I'm going to go over those. I do import HTTP client, and that lets us call an API, call another like website, an endpoint to get stuff. So this is going to handle like AJAX stuff for us without us having to set it up manually ourselves. It makes it a lot quicker and easier in most cases. And then when you add this, it's kind of like that forms module. You have to make sure that you have it also, the HTTP client module in your imports in app module. And most of the time, if you run into an error, it's because you imported something to a page and you didn't get the corresponding module that it requires into app module. Not everything needs it, but some things do. Forms needs it, and HTTP client needs it. So we've got that in there. And oh my gosh, here it is. So we've got that imported. We've got our Madlib template interface imported just so that we can have that strong typing. And then observable from RxJS, which is going to handle kind of like a promise to let us do things a little bit asynchronously, so we can set something to wait for something else. So in the service, when it starts out, you're going to have an empty constructor. It's going to have nothing. So you want to add in private, and the common way to name this is HTTP. You can name it whatever you want. It'll let you, but the common way to name it is HTTP. And then this colon here says what type is HTTP, so you have to give it this type. It's HTTP client. And then we just have one function in here, and it's get new madlib. And that function, this little colon here tells it what the function returns. So the function is going to return an observable of type madlib template. So if we try to return a string here, it's going to tell us like, no, you can't return a string. That's not what we want. So like, it's angry because you can't return void. You have to return this type that it expects, which is a little annoying sometimes, but also really helpful because it's telling you, hey, your code isn't going to run. So right here, we're returning. We're going to call this. That's just, the scope. This.http. So we're using this HTTP client. And then we can say get. And you can call this generically, but the preferred way is to know what type you're getting back. So this angle brackets lets us say we want it to be this type. And then the normal like function call parentheses. And so what we're giving it is a really long string. This is just the Madlib's Heroku app API. And then it's taking some parameters because I'm limiting it to 15 for the max length of blanks. So we don't have to say here for me to fill in like 50 blanks. And min length is going to be 2. And we don't have to give it anything else. This one, I chose this API because it's really easy to connect to. We don't have to worry about like access tokens or headers or anything. But if you did need a header, that would be the next thing that you enter. It would just be like comma, and look, you can see it wants like options. So you would give it this little bracket And then we can give it headers, and these are all optional. You don't have to do them, but if I wanted headers, I would do something like that. And then new HTTP headers. And I would fill in all of the, all of the different header values that I want to give it. In this case, we don't want that, so I'm going to get rid of it again. And I'm just going to undo everything I just did to make sure I didn't type something wrong. Okay. So that's going to call out to this API or this like endpoint and give us back the JSON object. It's going to fit into this template type. So it's going to have all the properties that we want it to have, or it's going to give us an error if it doesn't have those things. And then we can use this back in our main component, our page component, I should say. So back in the Madlib page component, instead of using this static template that I had pasted in, we can clear all of that out. Okay, and we're still going to tell it that it expects this specific type. And then when you originally created this, again, it would have had an empty constructor. It would look like that, and we would have nothing in it. So we have to add this service that we want. And I really like Visual Studio Code because it helps me with my imports, so I don't have to remember where everything is and manually type in all these paths. I can just start typing in it. Usually just brings it up for me. So this is going to be, I just removed that import so I can try to show you a little bit of how it tries to help. So I would say private, I'm going to call it service. If I had more than one service, I would name them more specifically. In this case, we only have one to worry about. And then I would say Madlib's service, and that import gets brought into the top for us. And that's, I know some others do that too, but that's why I really like Visual Studio Code, because I have a terrible time remembering all the paths for things, and I hate having to look them up and copy and paste them. So once we've got that put into our constructor, we can use it in a new method. I named this one getNewStory. And it's going to say this.service, that service that we just imported. We're going to call getNewMadlib, which is the function that we added to our service. And then we use subscribe because it's returning an observable, and so we say subscribe to say wait until this actually gives me a value. Once it gives you a value, the standard setup would be like this. Let me just clear this out momentarily. So the standard setup is like, I can get result, and then we do like an arrow function kind of thing. And then I can say like this dot variable equals result. So we wait to assign that until we have the value back. And you can also do a whole bunch of things, like I can say in the case of an error, that would be the next one. And I don't have to put this, but I can. In the case of an error, like, I don't know, whatever, like handle the error, however we want to do that. And then the last one would be like, this would be like the finally case. So it's usually just an open function, like no inputs, but it's still like those arrow functions. And then this would be like, at the end, after all of this other stuff has happened, I still want it to always do this last thing, and that would be like where you would put that last thing. But that's just a little bit of like stuff that you don't need for this, but stuff that you might run into, stuff that you might want to use. So going back to how I had it, in this case, we want new Madlib template. So that's like result, but we're naming it more specifically just for clarity. When we get that Madlib template back, I don't know why I put parentheses around that because you don't need it. We want to say this.madlib template equals new Madlib template. And it's just going to assign that new value. And that's all it's doing. So it calls our service, it goes out to that API and gets a new object, and then once it's back, then it assigns the new one for us. So now that I've got that in there, we can go back into the HTML and add that new button. I'm just gonna copy it so it's always showing at first. Okay, so we're gonna have another mat raised button type of button, and on click it's gonna get new story, that function that we just set up, and the button is gonna say new. So if we save all of this, right now we've got nothing, but if we say new, then it loads a new one, and it happened to be Piranha Infested River, but we can also click new again and hopefully get something else. Of course, there's only like 3 of them that it ever returns, so okay, there we go. Talk like a pirate. So there's only a few of them for this API, so we run into the same ones a lot anyway. So that's how we get a new one, but we want it to like actually have a new one when we load it. So that's where we get into like lifecycle hooks. And the most common one, the one that's always going to be imported because you need it most of the time, is ng on init. And if you didn't have this in, to add it, you would just say like, here's my class name. It would be like that. Normally it does this for you. It says implements on init, and then down here you have to have this function called ng on init, and it looks for that. And for this, we want to say on init call get new story so that we can get a new story automatically when the page loads. So if we save that, we should have a new story as soon as it refreshes. There we go. Then we get a new story. And it turns out like it's only giving me like 2 different stories. So it doesn't look like much is changing, but it is. So we got the new story when the page loads. And that's like the basics of like calling an API. You can do the same thing. Instead of get, you can do post, and it will expect a body that you can add to it, an object that you want to post. But I don't have anything set up to work with that, so I can't really show it. But the other thing that you're commonly going to want to do is, like, most apps aren't just one page. They'll usually have a couple of things, right? Like these would be navigating to a bunch of different pages. So what I'm going to try to do now, and hopefully not fumble it too badly, is I'm going to stop having it serve to the browser and close this. And then I'm going to try to set up another page so I can show you routing. So we're going to do ng generate component, and I'm going to call it instructions page. And that will run and generate another folder and component for us. And there it is. There's the new one. It's called instructions page. And we've got the CSS and the HTML and the TypeScript all set up for us. And so when it creates a new one, it just has this instructions page works, so that if you import it to anything, it automatically runs something. So we know that we have something in there that will show once we get it showing, but first we have to figure out how to route between 2 different components to switch which one is showing. So that routing flag at the beginning when we created a new one, that's right here, and it sets up this routing module for us. And in Angular, the way to set up routes is all of this, which we don't have to worry about setting up ourselves, and then there's this routes constant. And in this array, we can add the different paths. So it's going to look like path. This one will be called instructions. And then we got to tell it which component that we want. In this case, it's going to be instructions page component. And then we also want to add one for our Madlibs page. So that one's going to be, we'll call it Madlib. And that component is Madlib page component. So now we've got two different paths, and we can set this up to go to each of those paths for us. So now that we have that one added, we're going to need to go into, back into that main app component HTML, and where we hard-coded this to import all this stuff, we actually want router outlet. And so we'll save that. And this is where Angular is going to look. It'll look for this element and plug in whatever component that the path calls for and show it in that space instead. So if I run this again, and it's thinking about it. Okay, that will let us do the different routes. So we had instructions and we had Madlib. So instruction page works. So that's showing instruction page. And then if we do Madlib, then it should load the Madlib page. And we can add those over here as well, so that we can actually click instead of typing it in up here. And that is right here. So on these are just like anchor tags, just normal anchor tags, but instead of href, let me remember what it is. It is, oh my goodness, of course I can't think of it. I do this every day and I can't think of it. It's the kind of thing that you kind of set up once and then like it's done for a project, so you don't do it very often. Router outlet, there we go. It's called router link. That's what I need. So we add router link, and this one's going to be for instructions. So this is going to tell it, go to the root URL and then do like /instructions. And we'll call it something that makes sense, like instructions. And then we'll do the same thing here. Oops, not instructions. We want this one to be Madlib. And if we save that, oh, and maybe take this one out too. And then go back to our app. It's got instructions and it's got Madlib. So if we click instructions, it goes to instructions. And if we click Madlib, it goes to Madlib. And we can take that 3 out because we don't need it. For some reason, it decided to stay in. And that's like the basics. Of course, there's like a whole bunch of things that you can clean up because I made this super messy. Like when you see all of that stuff load and it looks kind of ugly, if we go back here to like loading a new one, if we switch back to the Madlib page, you'll see like there's buttons that kind of flash and it doesn't look real pretty for a second. We can hide those until it actually loads if we want to. So I'm gonna take away that new button just because we don't want it. And then I'm going to take away this version of the story because I'm wrapping it in a container. This ng container, it works kind of like a div so that I can add different properties to it, but it actually doesn't show up like a div when the page renders. So I've got that same story display component, and then this button. The new button is going to only show up after you finish the last one. So only when the story is showing will you see the new button. But then I can wrap all of this in a container if I want to, hide it until the story is actually loaded, or until like the Madlib template is actually loaded. So we do ng container, and then we'll do ng if. And then we're going to look back here. The properties that we have available, we know that the template is going to be like undefined or null until it loads. So we can say if we don't have this value, then we want to hide the page. So, oops. Back in here, we'll say ng if not Madlib template, and move this down to the bottom. So if we don't have a template, we don't want to show anything on this whole page. And I should have put it all the way at the top too, because we also won't have a title to show. But then we're going to have an empty page, so you'll often see people do like a loading icon. In this case, we're not going to worry about a loading icon, but we can just have a little loading message. If this you can say page is loading. Oh no, I messed something up. Let's see what I messed up. Oh, we have an unexpected closing tag. So, oh, there we go. That one closed already. There we go. I had too many of that closing tag. Now it should work. There we go. Oh no, it says page is loading and it never switches because I did something wrong. Okay. I can try to figure this out if you guys want to sit through me figuring it out. Or we can just set a flag instead of relying on that value. So we can say something like is loading, and by default we want is loading will be a boolean, and we'll say is true by default, so that when it starts up it thinks yes, it's loading. And then when we get a new story, instead of just assigning the variable here, we're actually going to do all of that error stuff that I showed you earlier. So get these all lined up. Okay, so this was that result case. And then here we'll do an error case, and it's really just going to log the error to the console. And then finally, after everything is done, we're going to say this dot is loading is false. And I don't need that. So when it's done with all that, it's going to set the flag to false. But every time we click new story, we still want to say, well, we're loading a new story. So is loading is going to be true at first. And then back on the page, instead of saying Madlib template, I'm going to say is loading And in this case, it's going to be not is loading, which hopefully works this time. There we go. So we go to instructions and we say, all right, really quick, you see it flash is loading, and then you don't see all those ugly buttons. You just see a little loading message. And in some cases, an API is going to take way longer, and that loading message is more important than it really was here. And then whatever you want to write on the instructions page, it doesn't really matter. We can say, and whatever we enter there, that's actually what's going to show on the instructions page. And that's about it. Is there anything anyone really wants to see or wants, like, I know I went really fast over a whole bunch of stuff. Is there something that anyone wants more explanation on that I can actually focus on? Oh, I suppose there is one more thing that I should show for routes, and that's, if I open this up, generally you'll like want some default route, and I forget exactly how that's set up either because you only ever need to do it once. You'll set up like a redirect. So this is what that'll look like. It'll be path is empty, and we want to say path match full. So we'll do that at the bottom here. So in the case that like the path is nothing, it's just like the root path here. Right now, it doesn't really load anything because it doesn't have anything to show. So we want to tell it, like, in the default case, we want to redirect to instructions, because that would be like probably what people need, right? And we say path match full just to be like, it just tells Angular like specifically match this, and don't like assume that like there's an empty string technically in front of other stuff, so use this for those too. Like it wants it to be exactly this empty string path. So when we save that and then we go to the empty path, it should redirect us to the instructions page. And there we go. So to show that again, if I just take it and make it just the root, in this case localhost, but it would be the root URL, it'll redirect to instructions. Those are like the most common things that you end up doing for most Angular apps. But yeah, is there any questions or anything anyone wants to see? Otherwise, I'll let everybody go and get back to their Sunday. No? Okay. Thank you guys for being here.